Getting your money's worth tonight, folks. First of all, I want to welcome the ASPA folks. I remember that I actually spoke to a meeting of the state chapter of ASPA probably about 35 years ago. I have some sense that the gentleman in charge, his first name was Wally, it could have been Wally Moon. He was from Natick, and I think the meeting was at Purcell's. And I remember a lot of things, but I especially remember when I was fed, because I was single till I was 41. So eating and giving a speech together was a really wonderful thing. Second, I was up way past my bedtime last night. I actually went to bed about 11:30, and then I couldn't sleep because I was worried about Suzanne Bump. So I got up, and after she was like 2 points ahead, I went to bed. I'm the amateur here. I'm just a kid from Dorchester, real estate lawyer, and I think about these things on weekends. What I did in the summertime when things were a little bit slower is I put some predictions on paper. I'm going to read them verbatim. I was mighty close. Then I'm going to share some thoughts that I wrote down when I couldn't sleep last night. Then I'll put a few points that I've come up with sitting here. Then I'm going to actually give the governor some advice because he needs some advice. One recalls that movie with Redford, the candidate, where he's in the bathroom, I think, with his brother, and he says, okay, we won, what do we do now? And then I'll respond to questions either formally or informally. I began focusing on what I expected, putting all the pieces together in my very amateurish way, would be a Democratic victory. Let me tell you why I thought that. Even though the first year or so of Governor Patrick's administration was not a success, generally, people liked him. At least more people liked him than didn't like him. People think of him as being honest. People enjoy seeing him, hearing him. That's not always the case with people in public life, and I know that from personal discussion, as does my friend Governor DiCara. And there were questions as to how well he performed, but it wasn't a question of people wondering about his integrity. And that's a big threshold. Charlie Baker was almost the opposite. Nobody really questioned his competence. Charlie Baker is a very intelligent and competent guy. People think of him as being a good manager. But being a candidate wasn't that easy for Charlie. Governor Dukakis and I remember Congressman Harrington. He told me once in the late 60s that he was more interested in running for governor than being governor. We may have had the same conversation with you. Charlie, I think, was very interested in being governor, but didn't necessarily enjoy campaigning. And after all he had ever done was run for the Board of Selectmen in Swampscott. Sorry if somebody here is from Swampscott. Not really heavy lifting as public sector jobs go. Mitt Romney benefited from that campaign against Ted Kennedy in 1994. He was a much better candidate as a result when he ran for governor. And was it because Charlie Baker was so tall? Is it that when a person is that tall, he or she, and they're usually he's, spend all of their time looking down at people, and people strain their necks to look up? Does that make it more awkward to relate to the common man and woman? Now, I also predicted that Tim Cahill would hold on to this slice of the electorate because there were people very much like him. I affectionately refer to them as angry Irish people. My wife, who's a Spillane, does not approve of that. But these are the folks who voted for Eddie King in 78 and 82. And I thought that they would stick with them, and most of them did. And there's more of them south of Boston than elsewhere, but they're scattered. And I also, although I didn't know this in August, was quite convinced that regardless of what happened, he'd stick it out. Because when you're in the business, it's very difficult to give up the fight. And I know that from personal experience. I ran for mayor of Boston in 1983, which for some of the undergraduates here could be 1883. I realized that. And one night Ray Flynn put his arm around me and he says, you know, Laugh, you know a lot about this stuff. He said, you'd be a great mayor, but not a lot of people are going to vote for you, which was the case. All of that was the case, by the way. And in the last month of the campaign, a very leading citizen of the city told me that he had arranged with David Finnegan, never gone public with this before, to appoint me to be director of the BRA, which is the second best job in city government, and all I had to do was drop out and endorse Finnegan. And had I done so, probably Finnegan would have been in the final against Mel King, because the delta between the vote he received and the vote Ray Flynn received was less than 3,000 votes, and I got 15. But I couldn't bring myself to do it, and I'm not regretting that, but it's very difficult when you're put in that position. Governor Dukakis and I attended a program called Boys State. He was a couple of years ahead of me. And now we do Boys State and Girls State together. And I remind our high school students there are 4 reasons why one person will vote for another: friends and neighbors, ethnicity, ideology, and gender. And I must admit, gender is a recent addition because it was not as important when I started thinking about these things decades ago. The Jill Stein candidacy did not really excite a lot of people. You know, she got a few votes in Cambridge, JP, the South End, Northampton, Amherst, where we'd expect. So let's face it was a contest among 3 men, all more or less the same age, all college educated, and I predicted that Cahill's votes would come from those middle class, mostly Catholic people, because neither Charlie nor Deval, even though they are ideologically quite different and come from different parties, and one is black and one is white, and there's a whole bunch of things that separate them, neither of them really can relate to those folks. They both live in an upper class world. They went to Ivy League institutions. They have prestigious graduate degrees. And culturally, Cahill can relate to those folks who neither Deval nor Baker can relate to. And I grew up in Dorchester, so I know those folks. They're my friends. So I predicted 46-42-12. No computers, just the old noggin and a stack full of PD-43s going back to 1966. And I predicted that in August, not knowing who would do a better job of getting folks out to vote. And also not knowing some of the surprises that might arise. And I've often thought that 20 or 30 years from now, when I start slowing down, I might write. And I'd like to write political fiction. If I put in some of the stuff that happened in the past month, it probably would be dismissed by an editor as being too unrealistic. So, the thoughts from last night. Deval's numbers were very strong where they had to be strong. They were strong in the cities, they were strong where people are black and Hispanic, they were strong in liberal suburbs. And those numbers were 2-to-1, 3-to-1, in a couple of cases, 4-to-1. The only way Baker could offset that was winning all the suburbs, all the vanilla places, 60-40. And to do that, he had to get the votes of suburban women. And I think that he lost votes of suburban women in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. He lost them because he refused to repudiate Jeff Perry. And as the father of 3 teenage daughters, I must tell you that if there was ever an example of a despicable person with a badge and a gun, it was Jeff Perry and his partner Flanagan. And one thinks of the old Mad magazine, what, be worried? You know, is this a problem? I think it's a problem. And I think Charlie Baker, who I personally think abhors any conduct such as that, is a dad himself, hurt himself among educated suburban women because he refused to repudiate Perry, and he campaigned with him. as recently as a week ago. Question is, will that impact Scott Brown? Will that impact Mitt Romney? Will Perry become an albatross around their respective necks? Because as anybody who runs for office knows, even before we were in the age of Google, one carries a lot of baggage the longer you've been in the business. I also think that some of those same people were upset by the whole Los Coco affair, which I tend to think Charlie Baker knew very little about until he was presented with an opportunity to try to break up Cahill's campaign. And in fact, I think it made Cahill more resolute. And I think it dirtied him. He's not basically a dirty guy. And I think that also hurt him in the burbs where he had to do really, really well. In those places where Weld and Romney were getting 62, 63, 64% of the vote. He didn't do it. Get out the vote. Chris and I both live in Jamaica Plain. In fact, you said you were married in my house. Right. And we've been there for 21 years. I've never got a door knocker reminding me to vote. I tend to vote every election. And because of the special election in JP, I'm voting 4 times in 8 weeks. It's like Christmas. So I think if I take a look at my 46-42, those extra points that Deval received was because he got the vote out. And they did a very good job of it. And any of us who live in places like Jamaica Plain, which are heavily Democratic, I mean, know all the phone calls one receives. The mayor calls me one day, and Barack calls me the next day. I mean, I get a lot of phone calls. And because we have 3 13-year-old girls, and they are now old enough to play back the recording machine. And they'll say, oh yeah, Tommy called up today. Oh great, what do you want? He wants you to vote. Okay, that's the way the discussion happens. But that get out the vote effort did not help the Democrats sitting in the legislature. And I just happen to have the stats right here. 9 incumbent Democratic reps were defeated by Republicans. 3 are in recounts, and a number of previously Democratic seats will now have a Republican in them. So bringing out those votes didn't necessarily help, because a lot of these are reps from places that lean Republican, and I expect the get out the vote effort was not as strong because the likelihood of getting out the right people to vote, right meaning voting for the Democratic ticket, was diminished. One last thought, and somebody here may be a political consultant. Forgive me if I beat up on you. A lot of money is spent on consultants. Most of them couldn't find their way from here to Ruggles Street, okay? And they take all their money and they take their 17% for the ad buy, and they try to make candidates out to be people they are not. They try to do it to Al Gore. May have been the difference, because Al had changed what he was wearing and everything. Al Gore's Al Gore, okay? You can't make him out to be a country boy when you go to St. Albans and, born with Ann Richards said, born with the silver foot in his mouth, or whatever. Okay? And I think they tried to make Charlie Baker into somebody he wasn't. I think he was awkward in being portrayed that way, and I think it hurt his campaign. Okay, thoughts from tonight. We have lost a lot of clout in D.C. First, Ted Kennedy died, and now our friends are losing their gavels and their staffs and their ability to set the agenda. And it will hurt. It will make it more difficult, even with a friendly Democrat in the White House, for us to get stuff done. And I'm not sure anybody's really calculated what that means. But believe you me, it's going to hurt. Next, Walter Lippmann used to talk of the law of politics and the law of the pendulum, back and forth. The Schlesingers, father and son, had this generational theory about how you had this movement left for a generation and this movement right for a generation with occasional aberrations. I predict that the pendulum will swing more often, perhaps more sharply, and that they may, as was the case in the late 40s and early 50s, stop moving offices around in D.C. because people are moving in and out of offices so quickly. I don't think we're in for a long Republican siege, nor do I think that the team I play on is going to be in power for a long time. This recession impacts different people than the recessions that was in place when Governor Dukakis had his first term and I was in the city council. And I was on the ballot in two very ugly years, 75 and 78, when people who nobody knew who they were came out of the caves and they basically voted against everybody. Nearly cost me my seat because I was the only member of the city council who had not participated in the anti-busing movement. Big full-page ads, the whole bit. This recession also impacts very negatively people who did everything right. It doesn't only impact folks back from Vietnam with PTSD, folks with drug and alcohol problems, people who've been kicked out of the house, people who dropped out of high school. A lot of people dropped out of high school in the 70s. It impacts people who went to good colleges, worked hard, went to law school, and are walking the streets. And at a certain point, those people, many of whom are white people living in the suburbs, get very angry. One other random thought before I give the governor some advice. The laws that some of us have worked very hard to create to limit individual contributions to campaigns are basically irrelevant. I happen to be a lobbyist. Hope I can still talk. And because I had a piece of business before a state agency. The most I can give is $200, which is, at this point in the nation's history, not a large contribution. When the governor and I started out, it was $3,000. I never got a $3,000 contribution, but I got a bunch of $1,000 checks when it was legal. To put in all the energy we do, reporting all of these checks, when some, what was it, the people out in Nevada, a construction worker and his son had this pact that put $100,000 against Barney, and no reporting because of the Supreme Court decision, means a lot of that stuff is irrelevant. Okay, quick advice to the governor. I'll be really staccato because the guy who's going to talk next was the governor. All I did was run for governor of Boise State, and I didn't win. I took advantage of my initials at the time. It was 1966. And I took advantage of my initials, and my slogan was "Fly high with LSD." It was unsuccessful. So, number one, there are three political parties in Massachusetts: Republicans, Democrats, and the legislature. Anybody who tries to govern without the legislature is asking for trouble. Number two, deal with casinos. Up, down, or stop dealing with it because it takes too much energy. Number three, don't expect bailouts from the feds. At some point, folks, they're going to start dealing with the deficit, and that's going to hurt the ability to deliver any money. Four, you cannot control state spending without dealing with the medical industrial complex. The state budget is more than 30% medical costs. It is straining the ability to do anything else. And it's accounted for 2/3 of all growth in the past 25 years. It's also important to deal with symbolic spending. I think, as a perfect example, Newton North High School. I think there's no reason why any school should cost $200 million except for a great university, Barry. And I don't think that the state should participate in treating the children of the rich better than they treat the children of everybody else. And number five, play to our strengths. Not everything that state government does works. Our strengths are brain and cranberries, and in the case of cranberries, we're second to Wisconsin. Sections of the state that work, such as the University of Massachusetts system, should be nurtured and should be let free, as has happened with most of the great state universities in the rest of the country. And pieces that do not work as well, and I speak specifically of community colleges, which primarily are employment agencies and ways to get students into debt, even if they don't graduate, should be looked at rather than given a lot of money. You have to pay talent. The delta between what people are paid in the public sector and the dreaded private sector has increased dramatically in my adult lifetime. When I was in the city council, I was receiving a pay comparable to that of associates in big law firms. The kinds of debt burdens that young people have today is the same whether you work for the city or the state or a big firm, a law firm or a consulting company. 7, challenge cities and towns to do things which they otherwise might want to do. Give them economic incentives. the 351 cities and towns make any sense. We've had that number since Prescott, Greenwich, Enfield, and Dana were flooded to make the Quabbin Reservoir. Every community has to have its own municipal government, its own set of boards, departments, advisory commissions. They all want their own fire department, their own police department. It just doesn't make any sense. Recently, the Boston Foundation put together a group of other foundations to get nonprofits to unite, to be more efficient. Maybe we should do the same for cities and towns. And down on the south coast, where we have a little house, the town of Mattapoisett constructed a rather large police station a generation ago. Now Marion has done the same, and this in a town with almost no crime, where the only time the police have ever used their guns was when there was a wild ostrich. We have too many school systems, each of which makes decisions about sports schedules and which holidays to take off, and when to have a late starting of school, and how to order food for the cafeteria. I think down in Clinton they have a school system for 245 students. Makes no sense, a luxury we cannot afford. Reject privatization as un-American. Young people should not be made to pay to play sports in high school. It discriminates against people who probably need athletics the most. And some towns think they're doing really nicely by setting a cap of $900 or $1,000. I grew up in the attic in Dorchester. That's a lot of money. Right-sized government, wherever you can. When I was in the council, we had the Traeger decision, and we had Prop 2.5. And Kevin White made some drastic decisions. And there's a part of the city called Charlestown. Some of you may live there. It was a very different neighborhood then. 15,000 people. We had 3 fire stations and a police station. And his wife was from there, which made it tougher. He closed 2 fire stations 30 years ago. He closed the police station, and what happened? The population of Charlestown increased, and property values went up 30 times in 30 years. And read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, A Team of Rivals. Surround yourself with a few gray hairs, a few of those who have battle scars. Don't be afraid of hiring the best and the brightest, even if they may disagree with you.